Sound speeds, and welcome back to Speed Bumps, the podcast that takes place during my drive home from set. This is lucky or unlucky number 13. And I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's get right into our question.
What a responsibility to do when we deal with DOPs. I know it's our responsibility to cover any timecode cables for any cameras they have on set, which is unfair to me as there are so many cameras with different cables to connect and many rental stores don't even have the cables. Anyway, this is what I'm told every time I'm dealing with DOPs. Finally, how well should you know each camera?
For the first part of your question, this is a yes or no type deal. Usually, if you're working on a bigger show or a union show, you're going to get rental for providing things to the show. Part of that may include cables for the sync boxes to actually synchronize with the camera. Now, normally carrying sync boxes and slates and things is a sound mixer responsibility, at least on the bigger shows it is. And quite often I have worked on shows where sound mixers carry an assortment of cables in order for those to get properly to the camera. Here's the thing though, there's a lot of different cameras out there and they're constantly changing the configurations and methods for you to synchronize to the camera. And sometimes there's a configuration or a box or something that the camera department puts on the camera which changes it from a 4-pin or a 5-pin LEMO, something along those lines, to something that is completely proprietary. And sometimes that means that you would have to spend a couple of $100, maybe as much as, in order to get the right kind of cable. Is it something that you should have to carry every single cable? No, but this is one of the things you need to discuss in prep. You need to find out what sync boxes or rather what cameras you're going to be using and at what cable you would need in order to connect up to the camera. You might want to carry the common configurations like different LEMO configurations and BNC, but you do not need to carry all of them if it is a proprietary type connection. You can tell the camera department, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get those yourself because I can't carry every cable known to man. There's a couple of new cameras I know that have different kinds of cables. There was recently something about this in one of the pro sound forums I remember reading about, where the sound mixers were not happy about having to spend $170 per cable simply because the mixer decided, or not the mixer, the camera manufacturer decided that they wanted to have a different configuration than they were normally having on their brand. Oh, geez. Yeah, let's accelerate, get in front of him. Okay, so that's just regarding the synchronizing of the cameras, which is something that comes from the sound department. The reason why is because camera can keep itself, synced with itself. But when it comes down to sound keeping sync with camera, we hold the time code. We generate the time code. We distribute that on slates and on sync boxes. And when we do that, it is our responsibility for delivering that to camera. Now, normally, what that would entail is us giving a sync box and timecode slates, smart slates, to the camera department. And they would then use them to slap the sticks and to jam the cameras and what have you. Now, there is different options out there for how to do this. Sometimes it's jamming the sync one time per day, and sometimes it is jamming multiple times per day. Depends on the show, really. There was a show I did back in the day where they wanted us to use a certain Sony sync box because it was a Sony sponsored show, and they said our sync boxes maintain sync all day long, and 14 hours into the day they were definitely drifting. But most of the time, what will happen is the sound mixer will have one of two systems. They're either a system that relies on wireless communication to keep things in sync, which is very common. The Betso systems, some of the ambient systems and stuff like that, some of the systems in general will do this, but not all of them do. Sometimes what a sound mixer will say is, I want you to re-jam at lunch. Sometimes they used to say back in the day, and some mixers still do, say, I want you to re-jam every 3 hours to make sure that we constantly maintain sync. And keep a close eye on the camera, because anytime they go off speed and then come back, you need to make sure the time code stays consistent. Sometimes even if if the camera department turns off the camera, it would lose its internal clock, and therefore you would have to re-jam at that point. Most of the time though, the camera department is responsible for their own time code boxes this day and age, and they will know that if they stab the camera with it, generate time code on the camera, and then they want to remove it, then it's their responsibility for putting it back on there, because a sound mixer will have their sound utility usually say, okay, well, this should ride on the camera. If you want to make sure you have proper sync the entire time, it should ride on the camera. Doesn't always happen though. And if that's the case, one of the things you can tell the camera department is if you don't want to ride it, that's fine, but you're going to manage jamming it every single time you go off speed or something like that, and you have to regain sync again, and you go back to your whatever your frame rate is that you're shooting at, 23976 or 24 or what have you. Now, you did also ask about your knowledge of cameras. Matt Price at Sound Rolling back a few years ago was very active about going through the different kinds of cameras that he ran into on set and talked about where you would go to for different settings like timecode. Most of the time this day and age, though, they'll change firmwares as they feel that they need to, and that will change where things are. Back in the earlier days of digital cameras, or let's just say the Area Alexa and the Red and things like that, when they started showing up on set, you would have the fan control and the timecode mainly being the two things that we would need to worry about, unless you were actually riding a courtesy track with something like an IFB on the actual camera itself to provide audio of the sound mixer's mix track. But many times, what this would entail is going into the camera, the same cameras over and over again on shows, and you would then know where that was in the firmware. But then they would change the firmware, and suddenly it wouldn't be under a designated timecode thing under system anymore. You would say, where is it? Where is it? What firmware do you have? I don't know where it is anymore, and it's because it was actually under audio now. They moved timecode under audio, or they would put it some other really weird place that it wouldn't be under system. It would be under, some completely random thing. And it would be a subset of something, and you're like, I don't know how to get to it. The second ACs were like, I don't know how to get to it either, and I'm going to have to go through this whole camera. But that's when it comes down to, sometimes they would say, you know what, I trust you, you figure it out, go through the settings and you figure it out, and show me where it is when you figure it out. But sometimes there are very, very protective ACs that say, nope, no sound person is going to touch the camera. It is our thing. We're going to be doing it. That's when you have to understand that they're responsible for the camera and the settings, and you definitely have to respect that. There was a show I did about 10 years ago. It was really funny. The two first ACs had totally different mindsets. One of them was an old first AC that retired a couple of years later. He had done movies like Back to the Future and a bunch of big movies back in the day. Like, you look at his resume, it was nonstop, big movie after big movie after big movie for decades. And then there was a newer first AC who had also worked on big movies, everything from Twilight to many of the bigger shows that we do in Atlanta now. But it was really funny because the old school guy, the film guy, he didn't care. He's like, yeah, touch the camera, that's fine. And the newer guy was very much a tech head, a gearhead, who was like, nope, I'm going to handle all this. And he stayed on top of everything, and he did not want anyone touching the camera unless they were the camera department. And it was really funny because one day I was trying to get his attention. I was like, I need to jam the cameras again. I need to jam the cameras. And they were like, we don't have time. We don't have time. And I'm like, we need to jam the cameras. We need to jam the cameras. And they're like, we don't have time. We don't have time. And I was like, you know what? I didn't want to run into a situation where we were going to be yelled at again from post. And the producers on that particular show had made a threat. They said, look, you got to be on top of your time code. If it's not, we'll find someone else that can. So it was falling on us. We were very much having to watch time code. And when camera did not want to prioritize it, I said, you know what? I personally, the utility we were working with was kind of nervous about it. I knew where it was in the menu. I said, you know what? I'm going to do it then. So I just said, I'm going to make this adjustment on timecode then. And I went right in there and I said, feel free to watch if you want to. And I hit menu and I started going through the thing. The A camera, first AC, was like, not caring in the world. He didn't seem to care at all. But when I went to the B camera, that was when the younger first AC, he jumped up, whoa, you can't touch the camera. And he got to get very, very upset. He was, and he started making this big, huge fuss out of it as if I was trying to mess with their settings and changing, their frame rate or ISO settings or something like that. And the other first AC, the old school dude, he comes up, whoa, what's going on? And he's like, a sound department person was messing with the settings on the camera. And it was funny because the old school guy says, oh, well, tell me if he pours water in it. And then he turns and walks away. Just not a care in the world. He's like, I trust this guy. I've worked with him many times before. I'm not going to worry about it. He was fine. It was really funny, though. So anyway, we got our time code square, and it was all well and good. Now, how well should you know those menus? Well, if you want to be on top of your game, definitely go through the menus if you can. do a search. If you find out that the cameras that you're going to be using on a particular show is a whatever red dragon with helium or whatever, if you find out what the camera is in advance, see if you can go to the manufacturer's website and look it up to find out where the settings are for fan control and for time code. Those are the two big ones. Sometimes audio too, if you need to put a courtesy track on there. But most of the people on bigger shows now, the union shows, don't do that anymore unless it's a commercial, if it's reality TV, or if it's something like ENG or something like that. Then they might put a courtesy track on there. The reason why we don't do it anymore on the scripted shows is because one of the issues we ran into about 10 years ago was post sometimes getting lazy, and they would not want to pull the actual audio from the card. So we said, you know what? You don't want to do that? That's fine. We just will not give you that track anymore. Because one of the things that we personally had on a team that I was part of is we had really good tracks, but we did this long walk and talk through this entire thing. There ended up being a little bit of static that made it in there, and post complained to us saying, what's with the static? What's with the static? Some mixer played it back. It was like, I listened to the tracks you were talking about. There's no static on there. And post was complaining. They're like, yes, there is. Listen to this part at this timestamp. He listened to it. It's like, there is nothing there. Then it hit us as to what they were doing. It says, yeah, you are listening to the card itself, right? He says, well, we pulled the tracks off of the camera footage. And we're like, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be pulling it off of the SD card. And that's when they were like, well, we didn't. He said, that's fine. That's fine. No problem then. And we just stopped. Therefore, we said, you're not going to get a courtesy track anymore. You should not be using that for the show, because back in those days, we were mixing. We actively used the mix in the shows that we worked on. That post wasn't recreating mix tracks at that point. They were using our mixes, and we did not want that to be potentially staticky or whatever, or subject to the preamps or the camera inputs on the footage itself, and subject to the camera department changing them or disabling them or doing whatever. We didn't want to have to mess with that anymore. So we said, you know what, no more courtesy tracks. And at that point, I remember hearing a lot of sound mixers saying, yeah, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so it became one of those things that was always pushed back. And the only time you'd ever really see that anymore was if you worked on a commercial or some sort of a day project, and there was like 30 producers there from the whoever the main sponsor for the commercial was. An Oreo commercial would have like a whole bunch of executives come in from wherever their headquarters were. They like to sit around and, have everybody's input be known and heard on the set. And that was great for them, but it gets really annoying when you do 30 takes of someone saying 3 lines, because every single executive has to make their worth known by being there on set and putting in suggestions, and we should do this variation, we should do this variation. But I guess you could say the good thing about that, working on a show like an Oreo commercial, is that you will have every single brand and kind of, or not brand, but every kind of Oreo you've ever seen in the world on the craft services table. So you could literally go to craft services and say, oh, I want to try a double stuff. I want to try one of these thin ones. I want to try one of ones that's mint. I want to try the inverted ones, whatever they're called. Anyway, you would have like 30 flavors of Oreos literally on the table. Even the Oreo chocolate bars, which I could tell you a story, but I'm not going to. But if you want to become familiar with every single camera, fine, go for it. If you work in commercial land, or you work on a lot of projects, and they could change the cameras out from project to project, and you work on 2 or 3 projects per week, it might be beneficial for you to know where those settings are. The reason I said fan settings is because back in the day, and it still sometimes happens now, if it's hot outside, the cameras will sometimes turn into a higher fan mode. And sometimes there are like record low settings, so that it will be blasting and cooling the camera down. As soon as you hit stop, then the fans come on. But as soon as you hit record, the fans go into a low mode, and that means that it's going to start to overheat. So as soon as you hit stop again, it's going to amp up again. But that's a problem if you end up having one camera do a late roll or they cut early. If that's the case, then you're going to end up having the fan noise kick in gear, and it's going to be crazy. Now, they have fixed a lot of this with firmware now, where you can dial in on the exact temperature you want. But here's the thing, especially if you're using something like a red camera, reds are notorious for overheating. Back in the day, I remember before they even gave the very first camera, the Red 1, the name the Red 1, they were actually running it on set, and I remember doing a show, and it was hot on set because we did not have the we didn't have any LED fixtures at the time, and things like Kinoflows and the fluorescent tubes that we were using transitioning from the big hot lights, those weren't even being used, so sets were extremely hot. And when that happened, the cameras were overheating constantly. That's one of the issues that we ran into with that very first Red camera. So quite literally, you would have the camera department putting down a towel on top of the camera, and then they would put like quadruple bagged ice packs and ice literally inside of bags. Then they would quadruple bag it and then stick it up on top of the towel that was sitting on top of the camera. You would literally have ice sitting on top of the camera. It was ridiculous back then. And I remember doing this and saying, what kind of idiotic, manufacturer is going to make a camera that's going to overheat on a film set? They make a film camera that's going to overheat, but that's Red for you. There's a lot of issues we ran into. Many of the time now, because of the resolution, they're being used on like bigger shows this day and age, and the bigger resolution allows them to do things like higher, VFX, and then they have the resolution to do, higher levels of VFX that look better, and then they can also future-proof projects by running it at a higher resolution, and then they could edit it there and then just release it in 4K, but it's going to end up having a higher resolution when it's released. If I remember correctly, Stranger Things season 2, when I was out there, they had a special resolution of 7040 by 3520, if memory serves. It was a 2-to-1 aspect ratio. It was very weird, but if you watch the show, it would have a 2-to-1 aspect ratio, and if memory serves, that's what it was. In my video, The Wider the Better, which I did like 5 years ago, I had recently come off of Stranger Things at the time, and I remembered it, and I said what it was. So if you want to watch The Wider the Better, I talk about it a little bit in that, because I'm talking about aspect ratios. But if you're doing something like that, like a lot of commercials, and you constantly are working with different cameras, it would be very beneficial for you to know where those time code settings are, where the fan settings are, even though you may not end up running into an issue, because most of the time fans are going to be controlled better, and they're going to be on better settings. And if you happen to be working on a bigger show where the fans are just going full blast, chances are that's going to be the least of your concerns, because they're going to ADR the entire movie anyway, because of the Ritter fans or whatever crazy fans that they're going to have going, and the fact that they're going to have three different cameras, and the DIT and everybody else is going to have all these noise-making fans right there on their camera systems, and they're going to have the super techno cranes making noise and everything else. It's just going to be right there making noise on set. So it's going to be irritating to listen to, but the fans on the cameras are probably going to be the least of your concerns in that circumstance. For the pro sound topic in this episode, I thought I would discuss sound mixing with a boom pole. Now, it might sound weird because you normally think of the sound mixer as the person with the faders. And there's a joke that we always, that you'll always hear amongst sound mixers saying, up makes it louder. Just remember that. And I always fire back with, unless you're a boom operator. Well, anyway, one of the things that us boom operators do is we mix as well. We only have one channel that we have to worry about. That's the boom, per se. We also might be watching after the second boom. We might also be listening for the wires and that kind of thing. But as a rule, what you would hear a boom operator say is, I'm most concerned about the microphone that I'm playing on set, because I'm going to make sure that I get all the dialogue that's on camera. I'm going to make sure that I get everything on camera. And if you have two people talking, you might cue easily back and forth between the two of them, or you may say, I'm going to bring in a second boom, and you just have two people planted in, one person, one boom operator on one person, one boom operator on another person. Sometimes mixers will say, I want the off-camera dialogue recorded as well, so the utility is going to do that. That's a blessing and a curse, just so you know, if you're thinking about that, because a lot of the time you will get something that that post might be able to use, provided the actors are delivering their dialogue the same way on camera as they do when they're off camera. Most of the time, though, actors will give it their all when they're on camera, and they won't necessarily give it their all when they're off camera, so the performances won't really match. But post does prefer to have as many things as you can give them, even room tone. If you want to give it to them, they're like, oh yes, I would love that, even though they don't even hardly ever use it. Because they can very easily wait until they have something like, and ready and action. That little pause before the director would yell action is when they're going to take that room tone sample. And then they can create as much as they want to with it in isotope. But anyway, getting sidetracked, as I often do. So sound mixing with a boom pole. What does that entail? Well, if you have yourself a microphone, you have to know the way that microphone sounds, and you have to know what that microphone is capable of picking up and how the actors and talent are going to be delivering those lines on set. You may have somebody that is louder than another actor, in which case you got to keep in mind that the closer you get a microphone, usually the better signal to noise ratio you're going to have. But what if an actor speaks up louder? What if they're louder by nature? And then you have someone that talks quieter. Does that mean you're going to drive in the microphone as close as you possibly can to the top of their head on both people? Well, if your mixer wants that, sure. But as a rule, the mixer is not going to want to bring down the level on the loudspeaker and then bring up the level again on the quiet speaker. They're going to want you to play a consistent level. That way they can basically sit there with their finger on the fader and not really have to move a whole lot. That's when it's most ideal for a mixer, is when they have a constant signal to noise ratio. Now what that means is that the boom operator has to do some mixing with the boom pole. And what that means is you would dig in on the person that's quieter, and then you would cue back to the louder person, because the ambience is going to be the same with regards to the microphone and how it's picking up people's level. Now that does mean that if you have a bad noise over there and you do not have that bad noise over there, and you're using a microphone that is going to pick up an ambient shift from you cueing the microphone back and forth, you may need to at that point rely on a second boom, or you might end up needing to change your angle up, still staying on axis on both talent, because if you don't do that, post is going to have to ADR the whole thing anyway. They would rather have a microphone that is on axis, even if it means that it's a little bit farther away, then they would rather it be off axis and very, very close. So if you have one microphone that's pointed at a talent over there and one person over here, and you're trying to cue both, and you cue the microphone over there for the person that's talking away, and you bring the microphone back here expecting to play on axis to the person over here, it's not going to sound the same. Even if you're cueing off of a background noise, post would rather you do what's called not break the plane, where you basically pick one angle and you cue back and forth between two people, and you do not shift the microphone around. You just basically maintain the same plane with the microphone going back and forth between two people. Now, this is both a good and bad thing, because it's good in the sense that post will have it easier by cueing back and forth. It's bad because the boom operator may end up having a little bit more difficulty getting to people in time if they can't play the pattern of the microphone. Another aspect to think about there is that if you are not breaking the plane, then you can still have an ambient shift depending on the distance that you're going. And one actor may be closer to a noise source than another actor, and therefore the ambience could change. So if I'm here and I'm talking and there's a couple of seconds gap between the dialogue and you have plenty of time to cue over there could be a shift that happens in the ambience as you move farther away from a noise source. Another aspect of this you might not even consider is that a boom operator is mainly pivoting between two different places, right? Well, if it's just a difference of doing this between a couple of different people, that's not going to shift a whole lot on the pattern of a microphone. Some microphones, though, will change a little bit. They'll have an axis that they're trying to that they're oriented towards, because they might only have vents on one side of the interference tube. And if that's the case, and you start shifting around too much, then that could bring in outside noises down the vents of the interference tube here. But then as soon as you shift over there, they're off axis more. So even if it sounds to your ear if you take off your headphones, like you're not really shifting your ambience, if you stand over here and stand over there, it might not sound different to you, but as soon as you take a microphone, you might notice that ambient shifting. So something you have to be aware of there. But when it comes down to mixing your levels for a mix, what happens if two people are different heights? Well, same kind of thing. You have to, even if they speak the same exact volume, that's when you might end up having to angle your microphone a little bit in order to play the taller person a little bit farther away, and that way you can cue back more to the person that is shorter. Because if there's, let's just say the camera is to the top of the person who's tall, and there's 1.5 feet of headroom over the person that's short, and they're having dialogue, you got to keep in mind the taller person's directing their voice upwards. The shorter person is directing their dialogue upwards a little bit, because you're talking to a taller person. If the tall person is delivering their dialogue looking down at the person, then they're going to be a little bit, their face is going to be buried a little bit, or directing their mouth slightly downwards. So instead of playing directly on top of the person that's standing, where tall, and then they tip their head down and they're off axis, kind of like, the microphone is up there. If I were to do this number right here, looking downwards, that changes my voice because I'm off axis. If I deliver my voice upwards toward the microphone, then it's going to be more on axis. So what you have to do is get your axis on to both people. The way you do that is by cueing in front of the person who's tilting their head down. That way you still can have your microphone line of sight to their mouth. And then you cue back to the shorter person. So you might be at the top of the tall person's headroom, but you might be a foot and a half away from the short person's top of their head, but you might be a foot and a half away from the tall person's mouth, and then just simply cue back and forth between the two people, and it sounds even. That's if their volumes are the same. So you have to play the track the way it makes sense. Boom operators have to figure this out when? In rehearsal. So when you watch the first team rehearsal, and then they bring in everybody to see the marking rehearsal, that's when a boom operator who is not familiar with these actors has to figure out the volume of the actors in the scene. Sometimes they're going to be louder, sometimes they're going to be quiet. They could have dynamics that they're playing for the scene. They might be someone that's constantly whispering and they're never going to speak up, and you could be in the middle of an industrial complex and everything is noisy, and then you're going to be frustrated and say, you're going to have to play the louds because we're not going to get any volume out of this person. Or you can ask the director over and over again, can this person speak up a little bit? But some actors still will not speak loud. They still will not speak up. They feel that for whatever reason, their voice sounds more husky and sexy if they talk quietly. I'm sorry, that's when your voice will not be heard. You don't sound more husky or sexy by lowering the volume of your voice. You do by changing your voice if that's what you want to do, if that's the sound you want to go for, but that doesn't mean that if you talk quietly, you're suddenly going to generate sexiness and huskiness in your voice. That's just the nature of the game. That's the way sound works. It doesn't just magically change characteristics because you decide to not engage your vocal folds in your throat. So anyway, the boom operator will learn this during rehearsal. Now, sometimes they'll say, we're not going to even bother rehearsing it, or they'll do a private rehearsal and they'll say, oh, they're in this position, so let's go ahead and send the actors into the works and we'll come back and then we'll just shoot it. And then you're like, well, geez, I never got my marking rehearsal. I don't know where people are. I don't know their volumes. I don't know these actors. I'm only day playing. Or it's the first day of the show. And that's a really bad habit to start off with, not even doing any kind of a rehearsal. But some shows do. So that's when you have to use the very first take, if they don't do a rehearsal with the actors, after they've gotten the lighting and everything into place. And the actors have gone through the works and they've gotten last looks. And you say, let's roll on the rehearsal. A roll rehearsal, as we call it. Well, if that's the case, then that's all well and good for the first AD trying to get their first shot off, but usually it's going to fall apart. The actors are not going to know where everything needs to be line-wise. Where do I deliver this line, on which mark, which color is my mark, and then they're going to not know that it was tweaked with a camera operator, so that way that this action would actually take place over here and not right here on this other thing. Actors don't know these things unless they're told. And so a first rehearsal, and I call it a rehearsal even though they roll on it, will fall apart. So anyway, if they don't do any kind of rehearsal at all, then feel free to do whatever you need to in order to boom the shot. And if you make it into the frame, say, yes, sorry, this was my rehearsal. Sorry. I haven't seen a rehearsal. Nobody else has seen a rehearsal, and you just decide to roll on it. You get what we get. Now we know, right? That's when you figure things out sometimes. You can play it safe if you want to, but if they're rocking a zoom lens and it's an 18 to 70, and you talk to the operator and they're like, yeah, we're going to be on a 50 mil, then we're going to push into a 60 and it's going to be tight. And then all of a sudden the DP tells them through their headsets, you need to go wide. And all of a sudden you're at 18 mil. Oh yeah, we caught you there. Where? Oh, I went out to an 18. At what point? Then you have to find out what point that is. Now I'm giving a lot of situations here that I've run into, starting to sound more like I'm bitter about certain circumstances, and yeah, to a certain degree I am, but I'm also giving you examples of real world scenarios that do happen. Usually, I will tell you this, in the more recent years, we run into less and less of this. Productions are trying to give sound a little bit more respect on set than they used to, even though on the really big shows, the Marvel, the DC Universe shows, they don't always have that luxury because they know they're going to ADR everything, and they're going to be fans all over set. So that at that point, you're just trying to get a guide track and the very best track you can, so that way they can ADR. So sometimes that's the nature of the beast. But, hey, it depends. But when it comes down to mixing as a boom operator, most of what your information is going to be from is going to be the rehearsal and then thinking about it and planning it out. That way you know if you're going to be needing a plant at a certain point, or if you're not going to be using a plant at all, you're going to be using a second boom. If so, how do you hand off from one person to the next? What are the assignments? At what point do you need to have a lav if someone's deep in the shot and you can't possibly get them? The sound mixer needs to know. The boom operator needs to know. The sound utility needs to know. And dude, you're going to crash into me if you keep riding my tail that close. Yeah, I see you back there getting frustrated. Sorry. Rush hour traffic, gotta love it. He's about to whip past me, watch. No, he's not. Okay. But anyway, so you have a boom that you're operating, and a lot of the information is going to come from the rehearsal. And so you got to understand that the information you have is the best you have to go on, and sometimes they're not easy. The headsets that people will wear, there'll be changes on the fly. There he goes, whipping past me. See, he's gonna whip all over the place. I know he's blurry, but you know, hey, whatever. What in the world? Transporter. Interesting license plate. There's no state. That looks like a fake. What if he's the transporter? Anyway, okay, hopefully you see where I'm going with this. Sorry, I'm so distracted at this point. Rush hour traffic and aggressive driving is not something that I want to have to deal with right now. Not after the day I've had today. But regardless, yeah, hopefully I made my point on this because I'm moving on. So thank you once again for tuning into the Speed Bumps podcast. This was episode 13. Now, if you have been paying attention, then you know that I did and committed to 10 episodes. Then I extended that test and did another 3 just to see if I could dial in on some technical aspects of what it is that I'm doing with regard to the show. Now, will I continue in the future? Who knows? It's going to depend on a few different factors. Number one, am I getting any more questions that could be for the Speed Bumps podcast? If not, I may choose to cancel it simply because there are no questions. And it doesn't mean ask me some crazy question just to get an answer out of me. What's a microphone? I'm just going to shoot you a link to one of my videos where I talk about it. And that's going to be that. I won't even necessarily answer you if you ask a really, really dumb question that's quite obvious, you know, that you're just being a, troll or whatever. But if you have a legit question, by all means, submit it. And if it's a good enough question for me to answer it, or you indicate that you would like it answered in the Speed Bumps podcast, by all means, I may end up choosing to continue the podcast at least another episode for that reason. But it's going to completely depend on that. Now, if you would like to record the outro for a future episode, if I choose to do any more, then by all means, follow the instructions down in the description below. Because if not, I may end up just recording it and just completely using the outro that I normally record or use, and you would not have your vocal talents highlighted in the description below and at the end of the episode. But either way, your choice, as always. Thanks for watching this episode of the Speed Bumps podcast, and we'll see if in the future I am back with another episode, but if not, I will be back with more sound advice.
If you'd like to ask a sound-related question to be answered in a future episode, send text, audio, or video to ssp@soundspeeds.us. Want to record this outro? Details in the description below. Find us on social media and online at www.soundspeeds.us. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more sound-related content.